We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Erin O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast. Welcome to Blue Skies. Today we're going to talk about this great country of ours, Canada. One of the largest countries in the world, diverse, strong, 10 great provinces, 13 territories. And in the general election in 2025, this was a major theme.
It's having one Canadian economy instead of 13.
On several occasions, Prime Minister Carney, asking for the trust of Canadians, said we can turn 13 economies into one economy. In fact, in May, after their throne speech, after winning the election, they had the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, which is now known for the major projects and other things we need to do, but always underscoring all the rhetoric about the challenges from the United States was breaking down internal trade barriers, getting a one economy approach to the Canadian economy, unlocking up to 4% of GDP just by eliminating these barriers. So today, a year and a bit after those grand promises, we're going to do a little bit of a report card, a little bit of a checkup to see how that one Canadian economy is going. And Blue Skies is so fortunate to be joined by the leading Canadian policy expert on this topic. Ryan Manucha is a research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute after a distinguished academic career with an economics degree from Yale, a law degree from Harvard, and that work at Harvard led to his first book, Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups. There's the little plug for it. Beyond just being an amazing title for a book on Canadian politics and public policy, the book did cause a bit of a sensation a few years ago. It won the Donner Prize for Public Policy in 2022, was a finalist the next year for the Balzilli Prize, and it really helped spark a conversation that then, with the re-election of Donald Trump, led us to this discussion about breaking down barriers in Canada. Let's do that today on Blue Skies. Welcome to Blue Skies, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's such a privilege to be here. Very excited.
Well, listen, we first started talking internal trade on the 501 streetcar in Toronto as we were going from the east end of the city to the downtown core. And you recognized me, I think, reading the Globe, and we had a great little talk about your book. What really led to the book? Talk a little bit about the work you were doing at Harvard and then how that translated into a book that's been widely read in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. I was studying international trade law, which was something I was really, really interested in at law school, when all of a sudden, this was back in 2018, 2019, a big domestic dispute arose where Alberta was trying to get more bitumen out to the coast, and BC, I mean, it's kind of a redux of present conversation. BC said no, so Alberta said, okay, in response, we're not going to sell any more BC wine in our liquor stores. And so you had this domestic trade battle taking place. And I said, well, what are the institutions to resolve this kind of dispute? What's our history with this? And as soon as I started pulling the thread, I learned about these incredible episodes in Canadian history, like these chicken and egg wars of the 1970s, where, protectionist egg and chicken industries were causing millions of eggs to rot literally in fields in Manitoba because of the provincialism of the Canadian system. So I was really trying to unpack, how did we get to where we are? Are we one nation where you can trade internally seamlessly, or are we like sovereign states with one another, and trying to figure out the puzzle?
So that dispute, which is still sort of raging, although the Prime Minister seems to have locked in an agreement with Premier Smith's government and reluctantly David Eby's government in BC to get a pipeline to Tidewater on the Pacific. But you saw how the provinces were using that to basically negotiate against one another, and it led to a wider piece. Did you do an essay at Harvard or anything that was an early version of this book that you then decided to grow?
It's very interesting we're talking this week, because just last week was the first internal trade court case in almost a decade between an Ontario construction company and the government of New Brunswick. And so when I was back in the early days, I was studying Canada's nascent internal trade court because no one had looked at the case law coming out of it. We'd had 13 disputes, whether it be about accounting or dairy or a few other things. But trying to figure out what is the jurisprudence, because if you have, again, in the case last week, it was this Ontario construction company who was winning contracts to repair bridges in New Brunswick. And the claim was that New Brunswick is holding this Ontario firm to a higher standard than the domestic New Brunswick equivalents in violation of our internal trade agreement. So that's where it all birthed from for me, which was studying what's the institutional apparatus to resolve these conflicts before we start whipping out the trade barrier pistols like complete blockages at internal frontiers.
Before the latest dust up, as you describe them in your book. Well, let's go back to the first word in the title. I'll do one last shameless plug for Ryan's book here. Booze. You didn't pick milk. You didn't pick eggs. You picked booze and cigarettes, which I guess, hasn't really changed from the early days of Canada. But the Gold Seal case, which you discuss in your book, which really set the tone for the challenges we have in terms of internal trade in Canada, set the scene. What was the Gold Seal case? Set the scene for why booze is the first word in the title of your book.
It's the early 1920s, late 1910s, and temperance is all the rage. Moral purity, especially in Western Canada, was something that the local electorate was very much in favor of. And so this wave of no alcohol in certain Western provinces was flooding through. And of course, who didn't like that? It was people who made business by selling booze. And so this entrepreneurial firm, this booze firm, said, you know what, let's try to get these temperance laws declared as unconstitutional. Break down temperance. And let's do so by pointing to what many call the Free Trade Clause in the Constitution Act. So they said, okay, we're going to send a shipment of booze from Calgary to Moose Jaw and ask the CPR to do so. And the CPR says, no, we can't do that. This is in violation of all those temperance laws that have been flying around. So they said, okay, CPR, we're taking you to court. What you're denying me is sort of protected under the Constitution. And so a story about an entrepreneurial booze firm trying to tear down temperance laws got us our first ever case on the meaning of internal free trade according to our Constitution. And according to those judges in the 1920s, none of whom really had economics degrees or had never been party to economics considerations, said, no, an internal trade barrier has to do with a customs duty or a tariff. If I don't see a customs duty or tariff, I don't think of it as an internal trade barrier, and therefore this temperance law was allowed to pass, and it does not consider to be in violation of the Free Trade Clause. And so, in the 1920s, the economics profession was dominated by the clergy, ex-stockbrokers. We really didn't have people who had PhDs in economics like we do today. It was very rudimentary, our thinking about economics and what a trade barrier was. And we never really considered, you could have things that are not tariffs act as trade barriers. And you might tell someone south of the border that there are other things other than tariffs that can serve as trade barriers. But that really had not entered the vernacular of certainly the judges of the Supreme Court in Canada in the 1920s. And so we got stuck with this idea of what is a trade barrier. And it's really affected us to the current day.
Let's break that down even more because, as you said, temperance was the issue. But the federal parliament had actually turned down a plebiscite on temperance, on prohibition, right? Which had actually slightly won. But the Parliament of Canada, probably in the lounges, which at that time had booze in them, kind of discounted the plebiscite and left it to the provinces to have their temperance decision. So the federal government could have made this a national policy, did not. Certain provinces did. In fact, I think certain cities did. Like Toronto, the downtown was a dry, and I always remember, the bars were set up just outside the town limits of Toronto and became quite famous because the downtown was for the teetotalers. Talk a little bit about Parliament ignoring the issue, then letting the provinces take it up.
Yeah. I mean, this has been a common theme, and I think you said it initially with the MOU with Alberta on pipelines, right? I think there's, and I'll give you another instance where the next big case, there are a couple of big cases, but let's pick on this one about, the cost of feed for turkeys in the 1950s, which was another big internal trade court case. The internal trade court, internal trade clause, free internal trade clause, has always been a device that people have used to achieve another means.
And that's section 121,
One section,
right?
yes, one section, 121. Because remember, go back in time, 1867, you had border agents at the border of Upper and Lower Canada at Coteau-du-Lac watching the flow of goods, between Upper and Lower Canada. Governments raised revenue on the backs of tariffs and customs duties. It was very hard to implement sophisticated income tax systems. Like, that was almost impossible in early Canada. But what the Fathers of Confederation truly understood, because twice in their adulthoods they'd seen sort of the economic order upended on them, was foreign trading partners changing the rules of the road. So they said, we need deeper internal markets to be able to withstand the ebbs and flows of what might happen externally to Canada. And so one of the things that they needed to densify and create deeper internal markets was say, okay, tariffs and customs duties, those are distortive. That's no longer going to be a legitimate means of you to raise revenue amongst the provinces. And so you create this delicate balancing act in the world's second largest country by landmass, these subnational units who need the ability to regulate in light of local circumstances on the one hand, but at the same time, we're all driving towards national objectives, national growth, national GDP, competitive economy that can, again, withstand what they saw in 1867 was the whims of the U.S. canceling an early U.S.-Canada free trade agreement. So the question is, how far and how quickly can the federal government really sort of act as a central convener on internal trade?
The court in the Gold Seal case, did they look at the constitutional debates? The whole, if you look at the One Canada Act of introduced in May 2025 by the Carney government, that was essentially the pitch of Sir John A. Macdonald with Confederation in the years after the U.S. Civil War. Even the Pacific Railway project was all about building east-west trade within Canada, internal trade, and an internal country to overcome the manifest destiny from the United States. So we're once again facing that, almost 160 years later. But did the court look at that as the legislative intent behind 121, the British North American Act, was to actually break down these barriers? Because, as you said, they kind of allowed barriers to be set up of a different type with temperance. But that decision became the precedent of the land and has kind of hamstrung the entire internal trade debate since.
Mm-hmm. The early 20th century high court jurisprudence on what is a power in the province's hands versus the federal government's hands was very delicate. It's both Canada's Supreme Court was actually not the highest final court until the late 40s, because many of the cases in some of the later internal trade court cases go all the way to England, because that was they were the highest court at that time, and they were trying to figure out again, another example of a free trade case was about whether or not New Brunswick had the ability to impose a provincial sales tax. Like, there were some very early Canada questions rearing their heads, and the internal trade clause kept popping up as a device that very smart lawyers were trying to use as a way to achieve either an end for a new power for a provincial government or mitigating a federal power. And it's very, very difficult, because you had, what many scholars would argue, you had an England that was very intent on ensuring provinces had more power than perhaps folks in Ottawa at the same time in the early 20th century would have wanted. So it's a challenge, because again, our highest court was not in Ottawa for a great period of time during when the table was being set on what is internal trade in Canada. This
issue was set in this post-temperance time, as you said, this sort of jurisprudence from the 30s, from the 20s, 30s, set the tone for how this free trade across Canada was going to be set. So it allowed these little fiefdoms to be set up. And then provincial regimes about beer, for example, that you had to brew the beer within the province to sell it within the province. All these little hierarchies kind of created an early Canada that allowed you to be a very big fish in a small pond, but not swim into any other pond. Was that kind of a reinforcing mechanism of this sort of provincial dominance, provincial protectionism, and the fact that the federal court had not allowed that to be broken down? It just built these fiefdoms up.
Canada was so small. I mean, you talked about Toronto a moment ago with the bars on the outer rims of the city. Think about like within the lifetime of the generation that was dealing with like in the early 20s and 30s, they were the sort of the inheritors, so the last vestiges of the family compact, where they were just trading around these positions of power within Upper Canada. And then you had the Chateau Clique over in Montreal. It was indeed about creating these little empires and ensuring that the right families were allowed to mint the right kind of cash and control the decisions of a population of Toronto, which barely 50 or 70 years prior to that was at 10,000. So you're absolutely right. Think about even bring us into sort of the modern day, and I'm sure you could speak to I don't want to put you on that spot, but the regulatory fiefdoms that do emerge over time and about sort of internal empire building. I'm reading this great book just at the beginning stages of it, but the licensing racket in the United States, where you create the credentialing system is a way to create again those it's the later stage version of the guilds, and for we can talk about why and the normative piece about it. Should we have these? Are these important to protect workers and protect consumers? But they are forms of protection, and they entrench the status quo.
Yes, and the status quo is entrenched right to the present day. So let's keep with the theme of booze. In 2012, a guy named Gerald Comeau bought some discount beer at the Costco in Quebec and tried to drive it home to his home in New Brunswick. Heaven forbid you have a flat of beer in your car as you're on the Trans-Canada traveling between Quebec and New Brunswick. But here we were again, a little under a century later. Tell me a little bit about the Comeau case and how the Supreme Court had a chance to look at this again, and what did they do?
Mm-hmm. Comeau entered the pantheon of internal trade gods when he took up his case in 2012, because he comes back with a trunk full of beer, and he had close to 12 cases, the limit being 12 beers, so he well in excess. Booze confiscated, $300 fine, but he doesn't just sit on that. He says this is crazy, and he found himself a willing lawyer. The Canadian Constitutional Foundation came in and sort of provided funding assistance, and he said let's make a change. It's a great story of a change maker from someone who didn't need to be given a title or a position. He said, I am going to try to make a difference here, and he tried to inch the internal trade narrative forward. And 2012 all the way to 2018, which is when the Supreme Court decision comes out, and he resoundingly loses. It's a shutout. We can talk about what the Supreme Court was trying to do. Was there a political sort of tension? There's a number of things. Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? And we're going to unpack that in this conversation. But Mr. Comeau was doing what I think that most other Canadians would do, which is react in an outcry about just doing a shopping on the other side of a Canadian border. And I'll tell you this as a code, and we're going to unpack the Comeau decision, I think, in this conversation, but New Brunswick fought tooth and nail all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won, and they kept that rule in place until early last year. All the Trump rhetoric comes out, and Premier Susan Holt comes out and removes the offending rule that got Comeau in so much trouble. It really does go to show how these are all choices, right? And they're all we're all circumstances or conditions, and our elected leaders, when they really care to, can make that change when it comes to an internal trade barrier when they're active.
Yes, and so can the courts. So let's go back to Comeau, because I actually thought the Supreme Court got it wrong. And I would love to hear your take as the constitutional expert. I'm an amateur that plays a lawyer occasionally on podcasts, but
you're too humble.
the The thing that drove me nuts, and I remember, I think I was running for leader the first or second time, and I did a video. My office was like across the street from the Supreme Court or across the parking lot. And I did a video basically saying, the Supreme Court all the time uses the living tree approach to the Constitution to look at an older issue in the modern setting, modern Canada. And I really thought there was an ability to relook at what was the jurisprudence going back to Gold Seal. I always found, as you said, it was, the justices at that time of the Gold Seal really didn't have an economic outlook. There was no study of law and economics. I did think it was quite ironic that Justice Duff of the famous Simpsons beer, Duff, was I think, I'm not sure if he wrote the opinion, but he was involved. This was a time that the modern court, the McLaughlin court by this point, could have revisited the matter. What are your thoughts on the decision? And, could it have been pushed to the legislatures and Parliament better? Was there a chance for the Supreme Court to see the rationale being advanced by Comeau?
Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court was afraid of changing an established understanding that had persisted for over, nearly a century at that point. The idea was, look, we're going to defer and give, room to the provinces to regulate under their, their constitutional heads of power. I'm not saying I agree with them. I think they got it wrong too. I think that they portrayed the Comeau decision as binary. There was one option or another option, and we don't like the option he's presenting, and they mischaracterized what he was asking for. So we're going to go and be very deferential. Mm-hmm. And they could have taken a middle road. And the leading scholar, the absolute leading scholar on the Trade and Commerce Clause in Canada, Professor Malcolm Lavoie, I think he was an intervener, was representing an intervener at that Supreme Court. And his enunciation of what the judicial test should be for the internal trade clause, that was, I think, the test that the Supreme Court should have adopted. And without getting too into the weeds of sort of, all the ins and outs of jurisprudence, what he was offering was, he was saying, look, you can't just take at face value the reason for a trade infringing regulation. Let's say like Ontario says, look, apples coming in from Quebec, we got to fumigate them like 5 times. We're really concerned about the consumer safety of this. And you say, okay, 5 times. That's like, I get you have an interest in consumer safety, Ontario, but like, that seems a little excessive. What happened? What about the second one didn't work for you? And so, Malcolm's test was effectively saying, like, you need to balance. There needs to be a necessity component to this, and you need to be a little bit more searching. Was there a less trade infringing way to achieve your policy objective? If you care about the health and safety of Ontario apple consumers, is there a way you could do this without fumigating 5 or 10 times, right? And his version of the test absolutely was at their fingertips. It's well used throughout other parts of Canadian jurisprudence, and they did not pick it up. And maybe in 20 years we'll get another case where they do. But I think you're right. I think that the Supreme Court jurisprudence on internal trade and internal labor mobility has been off for the past 25 years. And it's gone in a direction with a set of Supreme Court justices who, again, getting into their heads, I think may be wanting to punt the issue back to the legislature and say, hey, this is the common understanding of things. Like, if you want to change it, that doesn't defend their interpretation of the mobility clause under the charter nor section 121. But that's sort of my read of the tea leaves. You probably have better insights.
No, maybe this new Chief Justice, big piece on the Globe, mm-hmm. on the weekend on Justice Wagner. Mm-hmm. I think I had said after the time, and in fact, one of my leaderships, maybe even in our final policy in 2021, I put forward an idea of having new federal legislation. We weren't going to call it the One Canada Act, but Internal Trade Barrier Act, and send it to the Supreme Court on a special reference to say, this is now our intention. This is what we think, and then send it as a reference, much like Harper had done with proposals to reform the Senate. That's what I was going to do. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, had I become Prime Minister. But I'm glad the subject's being debated now, mm-hmm. and I do think that the Trump reelection reignited the need for us to visit this. There's various Bank of Canada and IMF studies that say to us, there's $80 billion plus, like 3.5% of GDP could be unlocked by taking down these barriers. And so why are we not doing it? So I want to go to the second part of the podcast, because we've talked about the booze. I had to start and we hammered home the booze. But we had the One Canadian Economy Act. In fact, the Conservatives and the minority Carney had at the time. And with MP departures, he seems to be majority, and then minority, minority. But the Conservatives helped pass Bill C-5. We're now a year later. Let's do a bit of a report card. And then we'll talk in a moment about the report you just did with the Ontario Chamber. But do we have one economy out of 13? How are we doing, Ryan, 1 year plus after passage of the One Canada Economy Act?
We were swamped last year with a lot of exciting announcements. For a guy who's been on internal trade and you've seen it too, it moves, like a iceberg sort of melting. Like the amount of announcements and momentum and excitement and energy last year, it was so exciting because usually it moves at a snail's pace. But the big thing is, do announcements translate to actual policy and implementation? And are people focused on the right things? Number one. Number two, are you truly and sincerely going to have an active central government form as a policy formation body around key technical, very entrenched subject matter and very entrenched internal trade barriers? When you and I met on that streetcar, I was really impressed with your command, and you've had command of the internal trade file for a long time, and connecting the dots. And we talk about booze, and I'd say 99.9% of folks who think about internal trade barriers think about it in terms of hard goods and alcohol. And you and I had that great conversation where we were talking about how wide-ranging an internal trade barrier should be conceived of as, right? We're talking about standards. We're talking about labor credentials. We're talking about movement of services across provincial borders. And when you start to open the aperture of what constitutes an internal trade barrier, which from my definition really is, it's the fragmentation amongst the provinces when it comes to key regulatory moments. That's where there's so much work. No longer does it take, 3 weeks to walk from, Kingston to Toronto? We cannot afford to regulate as if we're all local economies anymore. We can't pretend that a country of 40 million can divine the best regulation for each aspect of the economy from coast to coast. And so this is what's been really exciting. So long story short, cautiously optimistic is so far, but I am seeing some of the wheels start to slow, and we can discuss that.
Okay, well, with your impeccable educational credentials, I'm going to make you give the government a grade so far. What do they get? Do they get a B, a C plus?
I'd give them a B plus or an A minus. And we're talking about the federal government here. I think I think that their focus on removing federal internal trade barriers was a little misleading. When, Carney comes up at his Davos speech and talks about the removal of most people who are not in the ins and outs of internal trade barriers heard that speech and said, he talked about we've removed all internal trade barriers. No, he talked about, first of all, federal, and he talked about removing them. Two things. Federal government doesn't really, they have some, and we can talk about what those are. It's a food inspection. But second of all, that's not their only role in the internal trade discourse. Their role is the convener amongst 13 subnational jurisdictions who need to align. And there's been a lot of incredible work. I have to give credit where credit's due. Pan-Canadian collaboration at a rate I have never seen on this internal trade file. Even studying it sort of pre-confederation to the present, it's really impressive. Substantively, we've moved forward 18 months out. But to portray the federal government's position as we're a bystander and we're observing, no. You have a very important central forcing role here. And as you said, you just talked about, the federal legislation that you could introduce. There is so much more the federal government could be doing on internal trade, and for them to suggest that sort of mission was accomplished, especially out of Davos, was quite misleading, and it creates so many unintended consequences for folks on the internal trade file because people get jaded. They say, "Oh, he said the internal trade barriers are gone." They don't get the federal asterisks, and then therefore, we're done. But I know they're not done. Therefore, this is never going to happen. It really starts to harm momentum on the file.
Well, listen, you gave a bit of a critique there, but you gave them an A minus. So you're the millennial great inflation product. I'm the jaded Gen Xer. I'm giving them a C plus. for the very reasons you said. Passing the One Canadian Economy Act, doing the mission accomplished in Davos, actually doesn't even touch it. And I really hope that the Prime Minister, with his economic bona fides, his high approval numbers right now, uses a bit of that political capital to advance this with the provinces. And now we're going to get into the real nitty gritty, which I thought your report with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce was very good. When people used to say to me, is it booze that's the big barrier to internal trade in Canada? And I have to give shout outs to MP Dan Albus from the Okanagan in British Columbia for the Free My Grape and Free My Beer sort of social media campaigns has shined the spotlight on it. And Dan also has a bill about using Canada Post to send booze, to use the federal area of jurisdiction. But I used to say the real barrier is construction in the National Capital Region, because we're talking about labor mobility of a tradesman or tradesperson in Ottawa who may want to build on a project in Gatineau. This is really the nitty gritty. It's labor mobility, it's provincial standardizations and credentialing. And a lot of that is status quo. As you said, the guilds, the unions, the sort of modern equivalent of the guilds don't want to have that labor mobility. Is that, in your view, the largest barrier to breaking down this internal trade barrier and unlocking that 4% of GDP?
Yeah, I'll give you a stat. Between 2005 and 2021, the regulatory burden on industry in those 15 years marched up 37% on Canadian firms. This was according to the Stats Canada. Like, that kind of statistic shows, like, regulation, the regulatory burden goes in one direction, and then compound it with the fact that it may not go in the same direction across the several provinces. It's the fiefdoms, the regulatory fiefdoms that get created. It's the inertia. It's the fear of changing. I mean, you've sat in a position as a minister, and there's folks who would have been underneath you. You get asked to change the rules of the road on how you regulate fall safety training, first aid kits. You're afraid for your minister to have to stand up and answer some outcome that came from changing the way that things were regulated, right? There is a risk aversion that really impedes. And so you need first ministers to be standing up and giving their teams the room to think differently. And I think, and not even necessarily first ministers, you get key ministers like Minister Bethlen Falvey in Ontario standing up and saying, Ontario, like just last week, I was astounded, standing up and saying, Ontario is going to join the securities passport system. This is like a sort of a new, the way that we modernize regulation for the securities industry. And the amount of inertia and pushback he and his team would have had to go through to make that change was monumental. So you need someone of that kind of willingness to stick their own neck out and say, I'm going to be the leader when it means Susan Holt saying we're going to get rid of the booze rules that got Comeau in trouble. It's that kind of leadership you hope to see in this kind of moment.
And we've seen a little bit of this in Western Canada, because there's been a bit of a Western Canada free trade pact between Alberta, Saskatchewan. Talk about that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. I think that, that last year, Premier Tim Houston got a lot of fanfare for being the first province to the trough post-Trump with internal trade legislation. But that sort of elided the fact that Premier Kenney, prior to Trump even being elected, 2021, was at the table with very, very impressive, far-reaching internal trade liberalization legislation. And that was kind of neglected. Alberta has always been at the vanguard of the internal trade conversation. And so I think that there was a little bit of, the excitement post-Trump, but like credit where credit is due, in Western Canada's internal trade pact with the New West Trade Partnership Agreement, trying to go farther than the rest of Canada on breaking down internal trade barriers is absolutely something that shouldn't be overlooked. And I'm very impressed with their constant leadership on that.
Great. So there's some great provincial leadership being shown. The federal government is still seized with it. So after a lot of fanfare, as you said, a little over a year ago, and in the election, we're in a bit of a lull. and we need to re-kick the conversation. And you've kind of done that with the recent Ontario Chamber of Commerce report on internal trade, where you highlighted 5 areas where there needs to be a prioritization. We've already touched on one of them, labor mobility. Second was construction and housing. That's almost related to the labor mobility in some ways. Third, transportation. Fourth, food and beverage. That's where the booze was sick in, and eggs and turkeys and some of the other things we've talked about. And fifth being capital mobility. Talk a little bit about the Ontario Chamber report and how you're trying to use that along with Dan Tisch and the Chamber and everybody that was a part of it to kickstart and get us out of this lull to make more progress on breaking down these barriers.
That was so thrilling. I'm so grateful to both Dan Tisch and Gilles Gerson at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. I went to Dan and I said, look, this was early this year, January, like Canada's business community has never self-organized around the concept of internal trade, and yet it affects them immensely and deeply. And I know that there's a continuous craving on the part of, internal trade policymakers. What should we be doing? What can we, let's not play whack-a-mole. Where are the issues? And then we will start to address them. In very effective fashion. So let's create like a feedback loop here. And so we brought together 100 business leaders, regulators, government officials, industry stakeholders to talk in those 5 verticals and create that. Because again, 5 years ago, we were talking about internal trade barriers as booze. It is not just booze. It's about electrical codes. It's about construction. It's about fall safety training programs incompatible across the provinces. And that's what this summit was meant to bring out and highlight. And so across those 5 verticals, very, very specific, substantive next steps. One of them having been the Ontario joining passport. And then obviously, Minister beat us to the punch last week, just as the report was coming out. So it was very impressive. So very, very exciting. And really, really deepening this, because we have the Council of the Federation meets this week in Charlottetown, and then the Committee on Internal Trade, Canada's senior-most internal trade ministers, meets next month in Iqaluit. So this is an incredible moment to see, and I will be reading the communiques coming out of both. What are they talking about internal trade? Because it really has waned. It really has waned. You've got a minister in Ottawa, Minister LeBlanc. Great deal of respect for him, but he's got a ton of portfolios, one of which is USMCA, versus last year when internal trade was its own standalone portfolio for a particular minister, which allowed for unbridled time and attention on it. And so it's really re-emphasizing it because, Erin, the stat is two-way trade with the U.S., $1.2 trillion, that's goods and services. Internal trade, $500 billion in goods and services within Canada. So it's something that deserves continued time and support to deepen our internal market.
Well said. As you said, Dominic is very busy, and Minister LeBlanc, particularly given the challenges of the U.S. relationship at present. I'm fortunate to sit on the Canada-U.S. Economic Council that the Prime Minister put together, that Dominic chairs alongside our chief negotiator, Janice Charette, and our ambassador, Mark Wiseman. Industry, former politicians, and policy advisors and sector labor unions. We're all there to really give the word we're hearing on the street. But you're right, the internal trade, economically very important, but doesn't get, a tenth of the coverage. So you're on Blue Skies, which I know, I hope Prime Minister Carney listens to regularly on his long runs, right? I like podcasts on some of my long runs or bike rides. So you being the leading policy light in this sector, you have an exclusive chance now to speak directly to Dominic and the Prime Minister. In the next year, if we were to kickstart out of this lull, you already gave them an A-, so they've got to like you. What are 1 or 2 things that the federal government should really do in the next 12 months to kick these barriers down once and for all? So we had the act last year, the One Canadian Economy Act. We had all that momentum. It's waning a bit. What's 1 or 2 things, Ryan, that you would recommend the Prime Minister, Minister LeBlanc, and the federal government to do to get this done?
1, support Senator Marty Klein's initiative to get the Competition Bureau to be our standing internal trade police force, if you will. Give them greater and concrete and specific advisory power, soft powers over internal trade and sort of they are the best in policing anti-competitive conduct and anti business the business practices that we want to disincentivize. They should they should have the tooling and then wherewithal to tackle internal trade. Number two, it is get stronger and using the power of the purse and knowing that you have the backstop of the Trade and Commerce Clause to bring together provinces where there is deadlock and there's atrophying momentum, and be that central government, be that convening force, and don't simply see yourself as this entity to eliminate exceptions and pull yourself out and say, hey, we've done our best. No, you've got to jump head first. You've got to be in there the deepest, because that's what the constitutional setup has led to in this situation.
Yeah, great 2 points. Did you have Professor Sunstein when you were at Harvard? Did you have a class with him, the famous nudge philosophy? These are nudges the federal government can do on a policy level, or to use the spending and the economic partnership to nudge in the right direction. Okay, you've talked federal. Now I'm going to flip this to a couple of provincial premiers. What are one or two things that you think the provinces, and I'm actually looking at my own here because I do think construction, labor mobility, Ontario and Quebec could actually take a lesson from Western Canada here. What's one or two things provincial premiers could do to play their role on breaking down these barriers?
Yeah. Labor mobility and services mobility across the country. If we have all these major projects, right, we need firms to be able to competitively bid on aspects of them to get them going, to get people to where they are needed. You want the best to be bidding on these projects, to be supporting the infrastructure build out of Canada. And if you're hammered because of a provincial frontier and sort of needless, unreasonable discrimination, that's going to harm all of our common interests. So it's making it easier. So when it comes to the 30-day labor service standard for getting people across borders, like Ontario has gone farther than that. Some other provinces have gone farther. There's no reason for it to get to close to 0 days, but at minimum, we need to be held accountable and we need to see that this is actually happening. So one thing is getting people quickly credentialed across the border, unless there's truly an unreasonable reason to do so, in which case let's see some writing and some justification for it.
Yeah, and let's break this down a little bit more. So credentialed, approved from one border to another, we're all talking in Canada. So if you're talking an electrician or a pipe fitter or a construction site manager in Ontario, you would think that we'd be satisfied for them to go to Quebec to do this. Mm-hmm. Is this the type of mini barriers that we're talking about, or is there something more detailed from a safety or regulatory standpoint that they're relying on to slow the mobility of these workers?
That's what, it's like turning an aircraft carrier. So the big thing last year, it's the closest thing we have in internal trade to a silver bullet, which is mutual recognition, which is saying, if you're going to say no to that inbound credentialed worker, why? Why? Is it justifiable? Is it defensible? If you can write out the reasoning and we can all see it, maybe we can say, okay, there's good reason for it. But right now we don't have regimes where that's sort of the de facto standard. And in Australia, they saw an abundant 20 occupations escalated to national licensing standards after doing what we're trying to do here within 5 years, because these regulators were in such common communication with one another, they realized we're actually not all that different than we thought we were. And so it was just so much easier after all that friction to just come to national licensing standards. Within the first 2 years of them implementing the regime that we're all dreaming of here for Canada, 15,000 Australians got to the other side of an Australian frontier within 2 years. There were real economic benefits. It's about the competitive intensity of Canada is what we're really driving towards. And then the thing is, think about things in terms of verticals, right? So I could say the definition of a first aid kit is 30 or 26 bandages. And you might say, okay, what difference is that really going to make? But let's talk about home construction and building. There's a whole bunch of barriers and patchworks that conflict to create much more expensive housing for Canadians. So it comes to first occupational health safety standards. It goes to electrical codes, the definition of high visibility safety apparel, the portability of workers' comp across borders. All of these intersect with the vertical Canadians actually care about. So my urging would be, think about priorities, Canadian priorities, and then think about the intervening barriers in terms of that priority, rather than standalone 20 versus 30 bandages in a first aid kit.
You need to be at that Council of the Federation meeting in Charlottetown. When is it? In a couple of weeks?
I think it's this week or next week. Yeah,
I'm going to make some calls. I think you need to light a fire. So you've given the grade to the federal government. You've mentioned Premier Holt a couple of times, Premier Houston. Who are one or two premiers that get an A or an A minus for advancing this, to give them shout outs from your point of view?
Houston, certainly kicking off a lot of the momentum. Ford, certainly credit where credit is due, creating the momentum, and could see more leadership out of Ford. He runs Canada's largest province, and the fact that in May 2026 they had all the provinces pretty much, save for two territories in Newfoundland, the territories in Newfoundland, said we're going to have direct to consumer for booze, and they did. That was like, in my mind, that's like a trade barrier we can deal with. Like, you were all used to one-click Amazon shopping. Like, you should be able to do that for Canadian booze to your doorstep. And they had all said, all the Canada's premiers, save for three, said we're going to do it by May 2026. Well, it's June 2026, and Erin, I don't know about you, but I can't order to my doorstep. They breached that, and that's on booze. We're not talking about anything more sophisticated than booze here. It's always about the booze. So we could see a little bit more leadership from Canada's largest province.
Absolutely. And technically it's July, but I won't, you're a Harvard guy. I won't challenge you on that. So a Donner Prize in your first book. What's on the agenda for Ryan next? Because your first book made and is continuing to make quite an impact on Canadian public policy, on Canada in this moment. What are you working on now in your research capacity at the CD? What do you see as being another important issue that you'd like to contribute to the national dialogue on?
Really continuously pushing on this Ontario Chamber Summit, where we got the direct feedback from businesses and creating that loop so that we can prioritize where to focus efforts. I think there's a lot of internal trade barriers when it comes to government procurement, which I know is an important issue that you're very well conversant on, but at the provincial level, how procurement should happen in a way that, again, creates domestic competitive intensity. And then number three is labor mobility, and how can we move the needle on making it easier for firms to bid on projects and send their teams to opportunities in another province, all driving towards growth and competitiveness.
Booze, cigarettes, and constitutional dust-ups should be mandatory reading for every elected official in Canada. We need fewer dust-ups and more collaboration. We need less elbows up rhetoric and more roll up your sleeves, get stuff done on this mandate. So I can't think of a better way for us to kickstart the national conversation on reducing internal trade barriers than having you, Ryan Manucha, on Blue Skies to talk about it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erin. This was a great conversation.
And thank you for tuning in to Blue Skies. This was a great conversation focused on building a strong, united, single Canadian economy. Let me know what you think. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thank you.